Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, and welcome to today's Ask the Expert session, which will focus on the United States Securities and Exchange Commission's proposed climate rule and what it means for facility management. The U.S. Securities Exchange Commission proposed a new rule, S7-10-22, which is on the enhancement and standardization of climate-related disclosures for investors, and it fundamentally affects the facilities management market. The proposed rule requires all public firms to disclose their climate risks separated into physical and transition risk components beginning in fiscal year 2023, which is right around the corner. Now, the Ask the Expert sessions are intended to introduce you to industry-leading experts shaping the future of the built environment, to give you insights into their work and how it will impact the FM profession and your job now and into the future. It will provide you the opportunity to ask these experts like George and Spenser, who we have today, about their work. And I'm very happy to introduce them. We have George Sullivan and Spenser Robinson. And George Sullivan has integrated over 30 years of experience in engineering industry, commodities trading, and building science into helping organizations all over the world meet their ESG goals by creating a transparent and globally accepted path to measurement, validation, and disclosure that meets United Nations guidelines and stands up to regulatory scrutiny. And we have Dr. Spenser Robinson, who is a professor at the Director of Real Estate at Central Michigan University. He's associate editor for the Journal of Sustainable Real Estate, a 2022 NAIOP Distinguished Fellow, and president-elect of the American Real Estate Society. He is an internationally recognized scholar in real estate sustainability and climate research. I am really excited to hear George and Spenser's presentation. Every time I speak with them, I'm blown away about the challenge ahead of us and all the steps that need to be addressed. But before we begin, we have a couple of housekeeping reminders. This session is being live streamed on LinkedIn, Facebook, and YouTube. So please use the chat function to let us know where you're watching this session from. Also, use the chat function to ask George and Spenser questions because they will be more than happy to answer them. This is the Ask the Expert session, so you'll be able to engage with them throughout the presentation. Now, there's one question which I know is going to be asked every single time, so I'll answer it immediately. George and Spenser's slides will be made available for attendees of today's session, so don't worry about that. And without further ado, I'd like to hand over the mic to Spenser to guide us through this transition relating to new climate disclosure regulations emerging in the United States.
Jeff, thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. And this is just a truly exciting time if you're involved in sustainability. There's a fantastic amount of changes going on, and the built environment, as many of you know, contributes anywhere from 30 to 50%, depending on the estimates we look at, of global greenhouse gases to the environment. There's tremendous opportunity to make a difference. And with respect to these new rules, there's going to be a lot of challenges to move into compliance. So we're going to review what this rule, which is currently a proposed rule and comment period, essentially outlines and how you can start to get prepared. As Jeff said, firms will be required to disclose climate risk, which we define into two parts: transition risk, or global greenhouse gases, and physical, which is the weather hazard risk, both acute, which is event, and chronic, which is long-term. Under transition, all public firms must report Scope 1 and Scope 2. And if you're not really familiar with those definitions, I'll explain them in more detail in a few minutes. Scope 3, which is much more challenging, and I think as an industry, we're still really wrapping our arms around the entire value chain that Scope 3 involves. All firms except for small reporting companies will have to report, or any firm that makes a claim. So if your firm makes a claim related to carbon neutrality on Scope 3, then they'll have to report. Really importantly, and we'll talk about this in a little more detail, all GHG reports must have external attestation. That means, just like a financial statement is currently audited by a third-party CPA, your GHG report will need to be audited by a third-party GHG expert. As a little definition, the public float of under 250 million is what we call a small reporting company. Let's look at scope 1, 2, and 3. This is a graph from the EPA. At a very high level, we're not going to go into a ton of detail. Scope 1 is greenhouse gas emissions that are generated by your firm. So if you are, say, a manufacturing company, things that you generate directly from the manufacturing process, from on-site landfills or wastewater treatment, those are directly generated in scope 1. Scope 2 is essentially the energy that your firm uses. So if you are purchasing energy from a utility provider, your building is using electricity or heat or steam, that is generally going to fall into scope 2. Scope 3 is the entire value chain. So everything from potentially travel to the supply chain. So if your firm is producing a widget and it requires certain component parts, the footprint of those component parts and the transit it takes to get there, those all could potentially be considered scope 3. As we alluded to, scope 3 is hard to measure because a lot of the supplier firms aren't at a point where they're really well disclosing what their carbon footprints are. There is something called an EPD, an environmental product disclosure. EPDs are becoming more and more popular, and I'll note here at the bottom, the GSA, the General Services Agency, which for those who aren't domestic, the GSA is the U.S. government agency that handles all U.S. government real estate owned and leased. They just posted in March a requirement for all concrete and asphalt to be carbon neutral with an EPD. The expectation is that this is going to increase. Because scope 3 is hard to measure, the SEC rule proposes to grant a safe harbor for, I believe, the first 3 years, although I'm not 100% sure, I should double check. And what that means is that so long as a firm is reasonable and discloses all material facts, we understand that there's going to be a little bit of guesswork in scope 3, that it may involve some estimations and assumptions. So for example, if you are a major retailer like a Target or a Walmart, and you are saying, look, we purchased this product, we're estimating what the impact of this product is because these vendors haven't told us yet. As long as you're making a reasonable estimate, you can't be sued 3 years later if you find out, hey, you know what, our carbon footprint was higher or lower on this product and we didn't know, as long as you made a reasonable estimate and disclosed it. Fraudulent statements, firms will still be liable for. So remember, GHG statements are going to be like financial statements. So in your scope 1 and your scope 2, if you make any material disclosures that are not accurate, you can be liable under all of the fraudulent statements in the same way that you could be under an accounting statement. So same in the scope 3, if you were to specifically omit something, or if you were to purposely make an untrue statement that was false or misleading, then the safe harbor does not apply. But so long as you are doing your best to disclose, you are protected legally at least. How do I measure GHG? Some firms have been very sophisticated on this and very advanced. Others are just figuring out how we're getting started. At the center of this picture is ISO 14064. The International Organization of Standards, or ISO, has this procedure with which we can measure GHG. ISO is accepted globally, and I'll detail a little bit more how we do that, or excuse me, what regions it's accepted in. At the center of this is ISO. Up on your screen is also the British Standards Institute PAS 2060. PAS 2060 is the BSI version of ISO 14064. In many countries and many systems, the greenhouse gas protocol put out by WRI is also accepted. The GHG protocol was at one point fully ISO aligned. It is not currently, but there was a Wall Street Journal article about a couple weeks ago stating that GHG is currently in the process of revising their measurement tactics, ideally to become ISO aligned, but I can't with certainty say that's what they intend to do. A little more on the ESG side, if you are making environmental social governance claims, the SEC put out a risk alert last March in which they essentially stated they're going to start regulating ESG. This climate proposal, I personally expect to be the first wave in that. I would expect in another 6 to 9 months, there'll be more ESG regulation around what an ESG disclosure should do. They referenced specifically 2 protocols in that risk alert. They said firms should be aligned with a global measurement system, such as the Equator Principles, which is a little more geared toward financial firms, or UNPRI, the United Nations Principles for Responsible Investment. Under UNPRI, there is an SDG, or Sustainable Development Goal, called SDG 13. SDG 13 is climate action. What we have anecdotally heard is that at some point moving forward, in order to claim SDG 13, you will have to be reporting into the Climate Neutral Now initiative of the UN, and that will involve an ISO 14064 or some other ones they do, but certainly that is the one that they will take. The SEC in their proposed rule tells exactly what firms will have to do, but unfortunately, it doesn't go into a ton of detail of exactly how to do that. It's currently in comment period, meaning anyone can comment on the nature of the rule or even things like how to enforce it. Happy to provide after this. I have a comment which is also an editorial in the Journal of Sustainable Real Estate recommending that the SEC use ISO as one of, if not the primary standard. And the reasons why outlined in more detail in that editorial are that it is approved globally. Europe, Japan, Australia, Singapore, here in North America, Canada, and Mexico take it. It is approved by the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, Climate Neutral Now initiative. Importantly, one of the goals of the SEC as they dictate the enforcement of this is to minimize the cost burden to existing firms. Of S&P firms that report their GHG, 2/3 of them are already using ISO 14064 as their primary reporting metric. Roughly half of the S&P 500 has subsidiary companies that are foreign. So if we're looking to reduce the compliance burden, using a system that's globally accepted, that 2/3 of the S&P is already using, is, at least from my predictive guess, almost a certainty to be one of, if not the only, primary accepted. When will this become a requirement for any public firm? If you are a large accelerated filer, which means a $700 million float, or an accelerated filer, they're a little bit different. Large accelerated filers will begin in fiscal year 2023, which means when you report in 2024, but you need to have that process moving forward. So during 2023, you can be measuring and reporting so you are prepared for those 2024 financials. For 2024, you will need limited assurance, which is essentially a lesser degree of verification, more spot verification, and by fiscal year 2026, you will need a greater standard of external attestation. So for the external attestation, scopes 1 and 2, you'll have to have the limited to start and then reasonable after the transition period. The initial proposal was a little bit vague on exactly what a GHG expert means. How do we qualify that? I can quite assure you, after me, you're going to hear from a GHG expert, George Sullivan. But legally, what the SEC does is a little bit ambiguous yet. One component of the reporting the SEC will require is to separately report all of your GHG use, independent of any renewable energy credits, renewable energy certificates, they're often called both, and any carbon offsets that your firm uses. So in one set of reporting, here is our carbon footprint based on the grid that we're in, and George is going to talk a little bit more about grids, without considering any carbon offsets that we may have generated or purchased, and then separately with them. You'll see there's 2 bullets there that they should be tracked and compliant. This is referring to both your RECs and your offsets. In the voluntary market, for both RECs and offsets, there's been a lack of enforcement of regulatory standard tracking and compliance. So if you are looking to get a REC, and again, George is going to talk about these in a little more detail, they have to be tracked of where they're coming from, retired in your name. Carbon offsets should be compliant with the United Nations clean development mechanisms. And again, track, retired, sold in a legally compliant way. There are a couple ways that can be done, but if you're using an SEC exchange, that will certainly cover any SEC regulatory rigor. The other component is physical risk. So physical risk for every physical asset will have to start being reported in 2024 for your 2023 assets. Acute risk or event-driven extreme weather, hurricane, flood, tornado, wildfire. Chronic risk, longer-term weather patterns, sustained higher temperatures, sea level rise, drought. This is also going to be a big change. There are a number of large climate risk assessment providers out there. Currently have the privilege of working with ULI, the Urban Land Institute, on a report for more the institutional investors, but that's going to stream down to a wide range of other facility managers, how people are using this data, where the gaps are, and some of the transparency that we should request. That'll come out ideally in August. There's also an ASTM property resilience assessment team I have the privilege of working on. ASTM, for those not familiar with it, is the standard that put out the environmental phase 1, 2, and 3, the property condition report. So anytime a commercial property is transacted by law, there is required to be an ASTM environmental phase 1. Let me rephrase that. It is not by law required, but if you want to have the prudent owner provision enacted so that you are not necessarily liable for any environmental contamination on the site, then you have to have ASTM environmental phase 1, property condition report. This under development property resilience assessment we hope to have out by the end of the year. The part that I have been most involved in is the stage 1, which would be analogous to a phase 1. And really where our focus has been is on transparency. How are we developing these physical risk assessments? What goes into them? How do we interpret them? Specifically, firms will be required to disclose anything that is material. So any material and anything that is an opportunity. So water. The proposed rule says if you are pulling water from any region, you will have to report the percentage of water you are pulling. Does changing water supply impact your business? Oil, manufacturing, agriculture, etc. Excess heat. Is there regional migration in, say, multifamily? Is energy demand for cooling a office building or a cold storage industrial facility? Will that energy demand create a material change or a material risk? If you have a coastal property anywhere along any coast, sea level rise is an issue. What are you doing to address it? What kind of risk, particularly the material risk, does it present to your asset? How much cost is your firm putting into cost and preparedness for acute risk? What resilience measures have you put in? What are costs incurred from any specific hazard? What are costs incurring preparing for any specific hazard? And you can see this is just the 2021 $1 billion weather climate disasters in the United States in 2021. This is from NOAA. There were quite a few. This is going to be a big and important issue. I appreciate you listening. I'm going to defer to George to talk a little bit more about GHG and RECs and offsets, but appreciate your time.
All right, Spenser, thank you so much for that. And I think we'll switch over to George and take questions at the end when they come up. But please, everybody, be sure to ask questions. I know this is a lot of complex information, so ask them in the chat. There's a lot of things already popping in my mind, so but we'll take that at the end.
And good morning, afternoon, evening to everyone. Let me get this into slideshow so that we can go ahead and take a look at this. And we're going to focus on something that's very close and dear to my heart, which is the confusion between RECs and offsets. So let's get into it. So what is a renewable energy certificate, right? Or a credit? And if you're referring to it as a credit, I will tell you that you're a novice, but learning. So just as a heads up, RECs, as they're commonly referred to, are generated by renewable energy systems and their power production going across a utility meter into the grid. So 1 megawatt hour of power generated going into the grid from a renewable energy facility is actually 1 REC. So, which does have a carbon footprint, because renewable energy does have a carbon footprint. It's not carbon free, but we can get further into that in a minute. And the US has been trading these quite extensively, and there are several programs that we've looked at that do not meet any sort of regulatory rigor, and we'll take a look at those also. So, and how do carbon offsets work? Well, a carbon offset is actually a offset or a reduction in carbon, right? So renewable energy has a carbon footprint on average of about 10 grams per kilowatt hour. Here in Chicago, the same kilowatt hour of grid electricity has 520 grams of carbon. So the delta T between those would be an offset or a reduction. So when you're planning your reductions, you can actually set up a carbon offset project if done appropriately. And carbon offsets actually are not something you just claim. They're actually specific CDMs, clean development mechanisms, that the UN has developed these methodologies under, as well as VERA and Gold Standard, that allow you to generate carbon offset projects. And we'll take a look at one of those. And they are a security here in the US. So you have to be underneath a regulated broker dealer to handle the offsets, to buy, sell, trade offsets. If you're not doing it on a public market, it's called a private placement, and there's quite a bit of additional paperwork that has to be done for that to occur. So just as a heads up, voluntary market, non-voluntary market. Spenser and I have spent a great deal of time looking into this, and it doesn't matter either or, they're listed as securities. So REC is not an offset, and we've seen this happen with USGBC's LEAD program, to where they're using RENE RECs and saying they have no carbon footprint, so you can use them as an offset. This is from EPA. They do have a carbon footprint. You cannot use them to claim carbon neutrality. You can only claim them to have a reduction factor. And we're going to get very specific about where you can get them from and how the grids work and what you can claim. So this gives you just a general review of RECs to offsets. One offset is 1 metric ton of CO2e not released or equivalently sequestered. So that's what that's at. And once again, the REC is the megawatt hour of renewable production, right? Which I already stated has an average of 10 grams per kilowatt hour. So let's take a look at the next slide. And this is once again a sort of rerun of Spenser's slide on common greenhouse gases and where they come from. This is particularly focused on your scope 2 and can be focused on your scope 1 if it's a behind the meter system. In other words, it doesn't go through the utility grid. It feeds directly into your facility to either battery bank or direct usage. So the megawatt hour is still a megawatt hour, scope 1 or scope 2. If you're buying it in the market, in a REC market, it's still a megawatt hour and still a REC. It is not an offset. And they're tracked separately, and we'll talk about that in just a second. So the US is really not one grid. The corporate GHG protocol says that the US is one grid. The EPA power purchase program claims it's one grid. You know, it is not one grid. We are a multi-grid country. We're very large. It was not considered when GHG protocol was written. as far as the US being one grid. There were some assumptions that have generated a lot of consumer problems. So in doing their reporting. And then the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, Climate Neutral Now, actually, which is SDG 13, relies on ISO, right? PRI also relies on ISO as its de facto measurement standard. And we actually are ISO 14001 auditors. All of our tools, everything else are third-party validated so that we are up to date, and they change. Databases for our stuff will actually change every 3 months as we have a global tool as countries update their scope 2 or electrical emissions. So, and then ISO and consumption. In ISO itself, right, it says market-based. Here in the US and across a number of other countries, for example, Japan, Canada, it's the provinces and states that actually generate the local utility market. They control the utility market. And so when it says market-based, what market are you in? I don't have a national grid that I buy electricity from. I have a local grid, which is controlled by the state that I live in or the province that I live in. So it is much more that view that we need to take when looking at RECs, as in renewable energy certificates, and what they can claim and how you have to track them. So basically, this breaks down the US into 4 major regions. And these are, we're going to talk about the FERC grids, the primary grids, right? And some of this does extend into Canada, as you can tell. So that's why I'm calling it 4 primary regions, because we actually have clients that have properties in Canada and look to apply RECs to those properties. Here in the US, it's even more straightforward as far as what the grids are. And then now we're going to break this back and step it down a little bit further. So now you can see the NERC-FERC grids, which are much more regional in aspect. And this is where you want to start. If you're looking at buying RECs or renewable energy certificates, are you in the NERC-FERC grids? Is the facility in the NERC-FERC grids? We see all the time companies buying greenie RECs that are generated in ERCOT and then applying them to their facilities in New York City or here in Chicago. It doesn't work. There's no electrical connection. So that's where the NERC-FERC grids break it out, because there's differences in electricity across all of the NERC-FERC grids. They do not automatically balance. The grids balance within themselves on the average. So that's what you're looking at. And then now we're going to take a deeper dive and go into E-grids, which are the local electrical grids. For example, here in Chicago, we're in a specific E-grid that's in green here on our map. And that gives you an idea of what those E-grids are. If you are buying RECs for any specific project or offsetting or reduction plan, I would tell you that you look at buying from a project within the E-grid. Green E does not offer RECs in all of the E-grids. They only offer them for ERCOT and for the MROW grid. That's it. So if you're outside of those, Green E is not going to work. There are some other issues with Green E, is that they offer no tracking and proof of retirement for RECs. So we've spent quite a bit of time talking to them and digging into it with clients. That has not yet been handed to us. So it makes it very tough if you're claiming renewable power use and a reduction and you don't have the RECs inventoried in an account. It's going to be really tough to make that claim. One of our clients, their SEC attorney, basically stated that the certificate that Green E gave the client was a grocery list. You can turn over the Sunday school certificate and use it to write your grocery list out, because that's how effective it was. So you can see that there's a lot of issues out there that have to be sorted through, that people are just, oh, it's greening, it's good. It is not. You have to dig into the detail. So let's talk about fuel switching for a second, which is a CDM that we use with a number of our clients when we look at developing a carbon offset project that they can use internally. And so this is CDM AM0091, and it's energy efficiency technologies and fuel switching in existing buildings or facilities is basically the way it works. And this is actually one of the few CDMs that's applicable across globally the planet for anybody doing a renewable energy project and buying renewable energy certificates. So, or NCREs in Chile, there are various names for it, but REC is a REC in our book. And what it allows you to do is, if you're buying it within the e-grid and you have a specific amount of power usage, just picking a number of 100,000 megawatt hours a month for your facilities, that will generate enough offsets to make a viable project. So, and as a side note, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change is reworking all of the clean development mechanism requirements to be reductions only. So we'll see if this survives past the end of the year or past 2024, right? So if you're looking at a project and you want to get it started, this CDM will run for 10 years, so you can actually go ahead and use it for that time frame. But there's a whole bunch of specific requirements for it. Let us know if you have questions. More than glad to explain it to you. But this is one that you want to look up. And a REC can become an offset, right? You need scale, as we talked about, right? 100,000, megawatt hours a month, right, is the scale of the RECs that you're going to have to be purchasing for your combined facilities within an e-grid, right? And then you can also use combined heat and power with fuel switching to generate natural gas, which has a smaller footprint through a chip system, to generate electricity on your facilities. That is another major movement that the Department of Energy here is writing checks for within the United States. They're looking for high energy use cold storage facilities, multi-unit family, right, large commercial buildings, retail developments, things of that nature, to use chips. And it increases grid reliability, it lowers your carbon footprint, and can become a carbon offset project. So just as a heads up, and everything is measured, filed on carbon offset registries. It's third-party reviewed, utmost of transparency. We actually do a lot of work with the Entrex carbon market, and we do the SEC review for the carbon market on all the offsets coming in. So if you're buying offsets, please understand that it's not only environmental, the reduction in metric tons of CO2 that you're getting, but you're also getting social and governance components to that carbon offset. And let me know if you have questions. Thank you. And I will turn it back to our presenter.
All right, George and Spenser, thank you so much for this introduction into the implications of the new SEC regulations on the built environment. One thing I think that a lot of people who are watching this presentation are thinking about is the complexity in this topic. You're already making reference to certain RECs or renewable energy certificates that you can't transfer across grids and things like that. That's one degree of complexity that's in there. So a question that I would ask is, how would you go about vetting your experts to help you help guide you on this journey, given that the time frame to start taking up this topic is relatively compressed?
Spenser, go ahead. I'll let you jump on that one first.
Punting this one to me. So I would look at a few things. I would ask them if they have ever filed specifically to United Nations. That standard is a little bit more rigorous. I would ask them on the GHG side what standard they're measuring to, and then do some of your own due diligence in terms of whether you think that's going to be SEC compliant. As with any big market shift, there are a number of firms out there making claims and who have been doing business in this space. And these people are really smart, motivated people, but the systems that they're using may or may not withstand regulatory rigor. So the question that I would ask is, are the vendors qualified in a way that I am 100% confident regulators will be satisfied with?
Right. And I would jump on it and just follow up with, if you're looking at software packages or experts, because we've seen this happening a lot with clients to where they've spent $25,000, $30,000, $40,000 for software packages to do their ESG calculations, especially the carbon footprinting. No third-party validation. What are you using? Are you using eGrid numbers? Are you using any of the above? Most of them are national averages. It's just sort of the whole nightmare. And then also too, if you're claiming that you've done this before and you're going to help me report to the UN, show me where your company's already reporting. Climate Neutral Now actually has a giant list of companies that are reporting. We report annually, and we're also on their vendor list for people that have already been vetted and meet that. And software can also be applied to that same list. So just as a heads up. So that's a key piece in knowing where to look and how to look. But show me your certification, show me where you're listed with the UN, show me your ISO certificate, show me, a whole bunch of things that you do and what sort of audits you have done.
Okay, so the red flags would be your audit experience, are you on the UN Climate Now webpage, your ISO certificates, things like that. So those are some good things to add in. We have a question from Dean Stanberry, who's asking about the proposed SEC disclosure requirements apply to publicly traded companies. But can't we expect those companies to require the same level of reporting from their privately held suppliers or partners?
I'll start with that one. Dean, that is a great question. And there are a few ways why this SEC requirement is going to impact the entire market across privately held companies as well. First is, as we alluded to earlier, if you supply a public company with a component, you are part of their scope 3. So as we begin to get our arms around scope 3, every major auto manufacturer is going to require all of their tier 1 auto suppliers. Every Target and Walmart supplier is going to be required by Target and Walmart to start having EPDs, to start having a clear carbon footprint. So if you supply any major company with your product, they almost certainly are going to start asking you these questions. Secondly, since we're in facilities, if your parent firm or the firm that ultimately owns your asset raises capital, anyone who raises outside capital is governed either by the SEC or FINRA. FINRA is under the SEC, and they're going to be subject to these same disclosure rules. Whether they're required to make any statement or not, it's a little bit ambiguous at this point, but the vast majority of large asset managers in real estate, the institutional owners managing the pension funds and the large billion-dollar type facilities, they all make ESG claims, and most of them have carbon neutrality goals. If you have a carbon neutrality goal that is publicly available, you're going to have to start doing it on a standard that will withstand that SEC rigor. Lastly, if you are a fully private company and you are making any environmental claim that relates to specifically, let's say, carbon neutrality, The FTC, or Federal Trade Commission, has some very specific language about advertising environmental benefits. This has not been previously enforced, but once there is clear guidance from the SEC on how you can interpret an environmental claim regarding carbon neutrality, if you as a private firm are making that claim and are not able to back it up to the same level of certainty that any public company would, you could potentially fall under liability from the FTC. So this has huge spillover effect across all types of firms.
And
Okay,
let me
sorry,
jump
go
in
ahead.
and just follow up with, if you're in somebody's supply chain, you're going to end up having to have and produce a product, you're going to have an EPD, which is an ISO 14024 audit, which is based on your ISO 14064. So neither one of those are fast, quick, or cheap, right? So you're definitely going to have that. And they're going to ask for the reporting. What we've worked with our clients on is, let's get you measured for scope 1 and 2, and then let's invite your supply chain in so they can see how it works.
Okay. No, those are some good points. Now I'm sitting there. I have some of the participants, and I've heard it in the industry before, that and you made reference to it about some of these voluntary certification entities. Some of them make broader ESG claims than others, but you have BREEAM, you have LEED, you have B Corp. So many of these companies that have taken a step down those directions, how well does it position them for this journey in meeting the SEC requirements?
I'll take this one. Not at all. And as a matter of fact, it puts you at risk remember, once this comes out, there are going to be defense firms that are going to be defending companies from lawsuits for making claims. We worked extensively with B Corps, and full transparency, we sit on the B Lab Japan, right, certification board for companies in Japan for our Tokyo office. We work with B Corp here in the US. They're all LEED based. Right now, LEED has not even been brought up. It's not a standard, right? It's a sort of rating system, a green building rating system. So any of the green building rating systems making claims, and you're saying you've got a green building, show me to ISO how that works, right? Or show me to corporate GHG how that works, because the LEED system does not cover you at all. Same with B Corp. If you're a B Corp and you're advertising it, or you're 1% for the planet, or any of these third-party nonprofit items that are out there, they were great advertising, but they've now put you at risk of being either sued by the regulator, dropped by your supply chain because you can't substantiate it, or 3, just sued because you're making public statements. And this is looking quite like the tobacco lawsuits for a lot of these third-party rating systems.
So let me maybe add and take a slightly softer position. LEED and BREEAM were great for the industry for a long time. They brought awareness of sustainability. They advanced a number of construction facilities professionals. That said, ISO and ANSI are global standards. We don't know 100% what the SEC will eventually settle on. What our sources are telling us, and the information we have, is that it's highly unlikely that USGBC and LEED and BREEAM certifications will meet the level that the SEC is going to require. So assuming that is the case, everything George said is 100% true. We don't know with 100% certainty that's what it will be, but we do know if you're looking at an ISO, that is going to be accepted. It's accepted in every country. I do think that those building certifications, while they have served a really great purpose, if you can show a potential client that you are carbon neutral under an ISO standard, isn't that an amazing ESG claim you can make to differentiate yourself and entice the customers and the employees that you want into a green building certification? Seems like this is a transition point to the next step where those certifications aren't going to necessarily mean as much anymore. And potentially, like George said, subject you to liability, depending on what the final rules are.
Okay, great. So just a quick follow-up question. How big is the greenwashing problem in the built environment space right now?
It's huge. So it's basically defrauding the consumer. These companies are defrauding consumers if you're selling direct to consumers. If you're making these claims and you're a multifamily REIT and you're stating that all of your projects are LEED certified and that they're the most efficient, and I will just lean on the efficiency side. If you look at Energy Star Portfolio Manager, most of the LEED projects do not make a score of 65 or better. So they are not even considered efficient under EPA's Portfolio Manager. So think about moving it one step further to ISO, right? So that's where that's at. So if you're looking at WELL, if you're looking at REAM, if you're looking at LEED, if you're looking at B Corp, we have several clients that are B Corps that have actually taken down their B Corp logos off their websites because the B Corp movement is making all sorts of claims about their reporting to the UN and doing all the rest of this through Race to Zero, but they're using LEED as that metric, which is not an acceptable. It's not corporate GHG, it's not ISO, and as a matter of fact, the UN has actually asked Climate Neutral Now to step in and help reorganize Race to Zero and get them on the proper reporting track.
And Jeff, I'll add, this is the whole reason why we have this new SEC proposed rule. There is greenwashing not just in real estate, but across every industry. And look, there's a lot of very smart, well-intentioned people who've been trying to do the right thing, but without agreed upon standards, without centralized reporting, there is a lot of wiggle room for firms to make claims, for vendors to make claims, and there's been little rigor in the substantiation of many of these claims. So there is definitely greenwashing, some of it intentional, some of it by well-meaning people who maybe don't have the degree of sophistication they need, and hopefully this will change a lot of that.
Okay, thanks for that. We have a question from one of our panelists about from Brent Ward, digging deep and asking questions to fix problems you didn't know you had in ways unexpected. As a federal and state-funded nonprofit Head Start program under $20 million per year in grants, what is our responsibility?
Very good question. The Fed has already rolled out, and it probably hasn't touched the Head Start programs, but the Fed has already rolled out, if you're getting any sort of federal money, you're going to have to report. That's just been the general guidance for any of these. If you're looking at schools, if you're looking at any of the rest of these, they're all in that implementation phase at this point. So, for example, if you go through, they're all waiting, sort of holding their breath for the SEC to come out with this, and then they're stating that they will follow whatever the federal guidelines are, and the SEC is setting those guidelines right now.
Okay. So one of the things I have a question, and we had the question about how do we vet experts. The other aspect is I think that this is a career path or an opportunity that many younger facility managers, other people in the built environment would be interested in pursuing. And it looks like there's a lot of need for brains and bodies to help tackle this. So what would be your recommendations as first steps into this space? How would you upgrade your skill set if you're already in this industry, or if you're a student interested in getting involved in this? Would you recommend getting involved?
Spenser, have at it.
Sure. So I'm a professor. I'm a big believer in education in general. So getting additional master's level education for those who already have an undergrad is generally a really good idea. At this point in the cycle, because there's all this ambiguity about what rules will be, I couldn't recommend a specific program academically that prepares you, but anything in, engineering, electricity, anything that is a quantitative science certainly helps prepare you for the next wave, including even masters in financial analysis. Anything that's very quantitative is going to get you set for what the next level is. In addition, for industry level certifications, and I'm sure George will talk about this, you can certainly get an ISO 14001 certification, but it is one of those certifications that, although truthfully not that difficult to get, until you actually get trained by someone in the industry or knows what they're doing, the piece of paper itself is not so meaningful. So look for people who know what they're doing, like George over here, and then additional education in a quantitative area, I think, is always a benefit personally.
And I would agree with Spenser 100% that picking up an ISO certification, because that's basically an international standard. A lot of firms actually already do ISO 9000 for quality, right? And we're seeing, especially on the manufacturing side or on the regulated side. So that's a good jumping off point, is to pick up the quality certification and then going to ISO 14001. We have a number of firms that have ISO auditors that are required. For example, in Texas, it's got to be an ISO 14001 auditor to review your EPA filings for your emissions if you're in oil and gas, right? So it's an interesting start on that, but once you get into the carbon and shredding it out, you need to be working with a lead auditor that actually specializes in this.
Lead as an LEAD auditor.
Yes, exactly, Spenser. Sorry, as an LEAD.
Yeah, LEAD auditor. Okay, fantastic. Now, when we started talking about some of the software programs that you started getting into, of warning about what not to buy, that many of them are using national averages, things like that, that are not up to snuff. Sorry. Are there any out there that you would recommend that would be interesting to pursue? I know it's something where it's still squidgy around the edges, but some that are at least ISO compliant.
Not that we've seen so far outside of our own. There is another firm, they're based out of Great Britain, and we actually collaborate back and forth with them, just as a heads up, that actually has a software platform that has been third-party validated to ISO. So we cannot say compliant, we are third-party validated to, right? So ISO is very specific. We are not, because I'm the databases that we draw from ours being global change. Some countries change them annually. Some change them every 2 years, like here in the US for our grid reporting. Others change them every 3 years, and some actually are not even reporting at all yet. So they're still trying to figure it out, depending on what country you're looking at. So, and it's that full disclosure. But so those are people that I would have to say are out there. There are two other firms that we work with exclusively here in North America to do our third-party reviews, because they're also in deep as far as the carbon side goes. So if you're looking at it, I would tell you that there are 3 solid firms here that I would rely on. Everybody else is sort of shaky.
Okay. All right. Other aspects, when we get into you mentioned it about the physical risks component of things, and we start talking about acute versus chronic, and in some of the aspects that are material, and you start talking about things that are related to being near the coast and how that is part of your reporting. And then I start thinking about the increasing incidents for different types of storms and things like that. How does that interplay with the different types of risks that you're exposed to, and how does that come into your reporting requirements?
There are a number of large, sophisticated firms that will provide you with a climate risk assessment based on an address.
Okay.
Where we are in the climate science is also kind of evolving. We can break up climate science into two kind of big categories. There's what we would call catastrophic risk assessment. Catastrophic risk assessment is generally backwards looking. So that is what insurance has been doing. And because insurance has been doing this a long time, we're reasonably sophisticated at the backwards looking risk. Insurance, however, typically insures 1 year at a time. So they're really looking at a 12-month risk cycle. In the built environment, we look at 10 to 25-year time horizons. When we're looking forward in the climate risk assessment, that involves looking at the RPCs, or the I have a little brain freeze what RPC stands for, but the different warming scenarios, 1.5, 2.5 degree warming scenarios that the IPCC has put out. Under those different scenarios, the forward-looking risk of hurricane, flood, wind, wildfire is all going to be different. Plus, you can look at them in 10 years, which I believe is Europe just put out their technical guidance, which is under comment. I think they recommended 10 years, if I recall correctly. You could also be looking at 25 or 50. If you're a facility manager for a core fund that holds buildings for at least 15 years, you're going to want to be looking at a 25-year time horizon, because if you're not going to sell for 15, the next buyer's looking at 10. I'm not going to specifically recommend any of the major climate providers, because, to paraphrase an analogy that one of them used, they're all using the same basic flour, eggs, and sugar. They're just making different kinds of dishes with them. And as you dive in, looking at transparency, unfortunately, I have seen the same asset at the same address have vastly different risk assessments across different parameters, be it hurricane, wildfire, et cetera, from different risk providers. And it's because they're all looking at it differently right now. It could come from the underlying data. The underlying data could be LiDAR-based, or it could be from flood maps. It could be outside of the US on different country-level data. We could be looking at 1-meter grids. We could be looking at 20-meter grids. It really depends on the data source and how they're doing it. Additionally, some firms think that risk is priced into the market today. And so they say, we're only going to look at the delta in forward-looking risk, which might mean that a building in Boston has a greater hurricane risk than a building in Florida, because it's increasing at a faster rate. Think, hey, we're already recording this. Some look at the total risk. Some provide a value at risk and use something like the market value of the building, which could be the right number. But on the other hand, a building in New York and a building in Dallas that are physically identical, though they'll have slightly different replacement costs, their market values will be wildly different. So we're really capturing all of that. Like a lot of things, the first step is to find a provider. And there are a number of really well-qualified large ones out there. Start familiarizing yourself with their output, and start asking those questions on how do they get it, and how do I start figuring out the entire portfolio that I manage, and what areas are material or high risk, and then where do we want to start mitigating, which would be its own hour conversation. So I'll give that as the high level overview.
And let me jump in here. It's not just the coasts. If you're on any sort of body of water, like here in Chicago, this past winter, the winter that we just went through, we saw huge amounts of erosion of the lakefront, where the new seawalls had not been, but yet we saw the seawalls being overtopped because the lake is at a 250-year high. Right? So the same goes with rivers in the southeast, right? And even here in the Midwest, to where bodies of water, because of the amount of rain and the increased amount of rain, the Midwest saw historic flood loads that we have not ever seen before, just with this last fall and spring, and with very little snowfall, right? So those are other things that you have to consider. It's not just, sea level rise. No, we're sort of going glug in the middle and southeast of the country also. The Southwest is on the other side of that, right? We've seen extensive drying, 20-year droughts. Look at Lake Mead. It's, so these are changing patterns, weather patterns.
Yeah, and we now have to begin documenting that. My question was going to be if the delta was as big in the climate side for dealing with these risk assessments as they are in the GHG emissions reporting side of things. And it sounds like it's kind of wild west in both sides of the equation there.
Well, and a lot of it's because we don't have really good predictive weather or climate models. Don't get me wrong, the European stuff is great, the US stuff is great, but we all watch the weather every day. So we know what we need to dress like, and we see what the accuracy levels are.
Yeah, I'll use a quick analogy. I know we're almost out of time. If you think of an economic forecast uses the same general underlying data, but you can have two economists come with wildly different predictions using the same data. We're close to there in climate, but not even quite, because we all haven't even agreed what exactly the right data to use is and what exactly the right forecasting method is. We'll get there, but we're not there yet. In the meantime, we are looking at a lot of variety, and like anything, the first step is just to start using something and understand it, whether it's ideal or not. You're not required to. So to at least move forward down that path and start the learning process, because it is a learning process.
All right. Well, thank you both so much. I think that was our last question. So please, thank you both, and thank you to everyone for your time and participation. I think we can agree they have two fantastic experts here, George Sullivan from Net Zero Analysis, and Spenser Robinson from Central Michigan University. Thank you both so much for taking the time to share your work and insights with us about this new emerging regulation that's coming to hit the built environment. I think there's a lot of catch up that we need to do as an industry as a whole. So thank you so much for giving those first initial insights so we could take steps towards that. And for everybody who's participating today in the next iteration of IFMA's FMJ magazine, I believe that's the July-August edition, which is focusing on sustainability. Both Spenser and George have written an article that highlights many of the issues that were brought up today. So please be on the lookout for that. So thank you all again for your time. Thank you, Spenser and George. Have a great rest of the day or evening, depending where you are. Thank you all so very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.